Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a Friday Reads and it's a Friday Reads of lots of newly published books. Perspectives by Laurent Binet, translated by Sam Taylor. And Kang, We Do Not Part, translated by E. Yaiwan and Paige and Ia Morris. Death Takes Me by Cristina Rivera Garza, translated by Sarah Booker and Robin Myers. So they are all new releases within the last couple of weeks. On the Greenwich Line by Egyptian author Shady Lewis, and this is translated by Catherine Halls. And then a couple of books of poetry, Solmaz, Sharif, Customs, and Claudia, Rankine, Plot. Okay, so I'm going to start with Binet. But before I hold up his new book, so these are his first two novels, HHHH and The Seventh Functional Language. Two of my favourite novels. They will make my top 50 books easily. I will leave links in the show notes to my reviews of both of these. And they were followed up by Civilizations, which I thought was absolute dreck. HHHH, set in the Second World War, Seventh Functional Language in 1980s France. Civilizations is a work of speculative history, but it's basically during the Renaissance period, the bulk of that book. So we come to Perspectives, which is set in Florence in the 15th century. And I hated it. And it leaves me very much in the camp of when his next book comes out, if it's relatively modern, i.e. Second World War or later, I'll happily read it. If it's delving back into history as far as these last two, I'm not interested. And to me that's a real fall from grace to have two books in my top 50, which is rare enough in itself, by the same author, to not even be prepared to read him again. As I say, it's just such a fall from grace. Why don't I like this? Why didn't I like this? So, as I say, it's set in the Florence of the 15th century, so there's lots of political conflicts going on. So there's the conflict between the Catholics and the emerging Protestantism, which is beginning to be exported from outside of Germany. There's the empires of France and Spain, who are battling to carve up the they're not independent kingdoms, to forge alliances so they basically pay tribute either to France or Spain. And in this case, it's currently allied with Spain. There's battles over art and how art is starting to throw off some of the shackles and strictures of religious art and get a bit more racy, a bit more nudity, and the sort of early Counter-Reformation movement against that. So there's all these sorts of conflicts going on, and the book starts with a framing device of the narrator, who won't reappear again in the novel, telling us that he's come by this remarkable bundle of letters, and the letters unfurl the story. So it's a epistolary novel, which I mean, I don't like them anyway. They seem rather quaint now in this age of fast communication of email and Snapchat and all this sort of stuff. But obviously this is a historical novel, so those sorts of things would be totally inappropriate and anachronistic. But the problem with epistolary novels is you're either describing actions that have already happened, or you're talking about future actions, but it's always in one voice, the voice of the letter writer. So there's no sense of movement, there's no sense of momentum. Yes, the plot is moved on by the bits of information you're given, but they're in the wrong tense almost. You know that they're telling you they're going to carry this out, but by the end of the letter you don't know if they've carried it out or not. Or they've told you that this happened in the past, but it's happened off stage effectively. It's not been described within the book. When it happens, there's no tension, there's no drive, and I find that is always a problem with the epistolary novels. So you've got this narrator who's framed the whole novel, and then the next thing is a list of the cast of characters, real historical people. I haven't counted them up, but I'm assuming there's around 20 of them. And what follows is letters exchanged between these 20 people according to their allegiances and deals and all that sort of stuff. But there's a huge plot hole right in the beginning of this novel, of the framing device. How has this one narrator got hold of these diverse letters from 20 or so people, and that, you know, some of them were antagonistic to other and wouldn't have written to each other or wouldn't be in possession of the letters? How has this one guy brought all of this together? And it's not like he's done research and he's found these letters in one library and that in another private archive. No, he says he's found them all bundled together in one. How? Who put them together? That question is never answered, is never even delved, and I never really got beyond that. So this novel just had a debilitating, contradiction, paradox I couldn't get past right at its very beginning. The novel itself is very competent, very sort of far-reaching account of this period. I don't know how true to life it is. Certainly the end is so ridiculous that it sort of tells you that, no, it's sort of veering back to the sort of speculative fiction or alternative history that this is. So the plot is sparked off where an artist has been commissioned to paint the ceiling and the walls of a chapel or a church in Florence, and it's going to rival St. Peter's in Rome. Only at the beginning of the novel he winds up dead on the scaffolding around his mural painting. And, you know, so far, so Name of the Rose, and that's another reason I don't know this. But, you know, this we don't need another Name of the Rose. We really don't. And this artist and the intrigue, as I say, it's not just politics, it's not just religion, it's also art. And it's all very competently handled, I will say that. Eventually we get, you know, through all these sort of shenanigans and Machiavellian, action, it's revealed at the end who killed him. And I won't spoil that, obviously, but it was absolutely ridiculous. And there's not much more to say than that. The other difference between his historical works and his more modern works is I loved the humour, particularly in Seventh Functional Language. There were laugh out loud moments, but even HHHH, there was like lots of, yeah, that's pretty sharp, that's pretty smart. The historical stuff, there was one good gag in the whole of Civilizations and no gags here. I think there's something about writing about historical periods that precludes translation of humour to the modern day, in the same way that most of Shakespeare's comedies, we don't really find that funny anymore. And, you know, just at every level, this book was an utter failure. I think in Goodreads I gave it 2 stars just because it was a very competent historical novel for most of it. But actually, since I've finished it and mulled it over, I think I'm going to change it to 1 star. Okay, on to Hang Kang, We Do Not Part. So I read this as part of a read-along with a group. I'll put in a text box in this because I can't remember the name of the group. But basically, they are reading a novel from a different part of the world every month. And this was the March one, Hang Kang, South Korea, Nobel Laureate Prize winner. And I was slightly disappointed in this, I have to say, although it's Hang Kang. I've given every one of her books to date 5 stars. This is the first of hers I've given 4 stars. So it's still highly recommended. I just think in the canon of her own work, as I read it, it wasn't as good. So it starts off with a writer who has delivered up a book to be published on the sort of uprising in 1980s Korea for democracy that was brutally crushed, just as Han Kang did in her book Human Acts. So it's sort of echoing that character. But she's so traumatised by the experience of having researched and written the book that she's persecuted by nightmarish visions. She can't sleep, she can't eat. and she realises that she's probably going to die if she carries on this course of action. But rather than try and counter it, because she feels she can't, it's so all-encompassing, this persecution, she decides instead she's going to write not a suicide letter, but a sort of similar to suicide letter to her family. But she can't get this letter right, which is an interesting thing for a writer, if you think about it, that they can project out all these terrible acts done upon human bodies in a fictional sense. When it comes to their own sort of personal physical degradation, she can't do it. So she keeps starting it fresh every time. This is going on and on and on. And she's only interrupted by a text message from a friend of hers who was probably her closest friend as they were sort of teens at university and all of that. But someone who's moved away from Seoul and she hasn't seen in a while. And it's a very strange text. It says, please come, but you must bring these items, which strike her as very strange. Anyway, so she goes to visit her in the hospital, and she sees that her friend has chopped off by accident 2 of her fingers, and they've been sewn back on, but the treatment to keep them, you know, free of infection and to help the graft back onto the, you know, it's very, very intense. So she's laid up in this bed, and her friend has said, thanks for coming, I need you to do one thing for me. I need you to go to my house and my workshop, which are together in the country, and feed my bird, because he's got no water and no food and he'll die. And she agrees to do this, and she takes a series of buses to get to this friend's house. Unfortunately, there's a huge snowstorm, and the description of snow, I can't remember, is it the Lap language or the Finnish language, where there's supposedly, I think this is slightly apocryphal, but it's the Eskimo language, that's right, where there's 40 words, different words for snow. Now, she's not using different words for snow, but the way she describes snow in different ways each time, different images, is just beautifully done. It's so imaginative. Sort of 40 different ways of describing snow, as it were. Anyway, so I'm not going to say more of the plot there, more about the plot beyond that. But what we get now is a series of recurring images. Obviously the snow. Snow as white. Snow as a white shroud. Snow as ghosts. You know, as well as snow, you get the shadows of the trees and moving in the wind and you know, looming up almost like human beings, more of which anon. In her book White, or the White Book, can't remember quite what the title was, she pointed out how white in certain Asian cultures is the colour of death, not black as we have it in the West. So there are all these images around snow, whiteness, shroud, death, ghosts. There's also, as I say, this image of trees as human beings, because one of the things that her friend was doing in her workshop was that they'd agreed verbally that they were going to do this sort of huge installation art project of using trees to represent people who'd been killed in these various political massacres. But the protagonist sort of loses belief in it and has sort of said, no, I'm not going to do it. But her friend had carried on and indeed was doing it when she accidentally cut off her 2 fingers. We get the notion of bodies and forms and outlines, so that there's a lot of jumping around in time in here, but it's done really well initially, I feel, between the now of the snow and the effect of the snow and the immediate effect of the snow, versus more sort of languid, reflective memories back to her and her friend talking and stuff. And on one of those occasions, the protagonist drew round the outline of her friend's shadow that was projected on the wall. And this notion of sort of containment and flickering movement of shadows is also significant. We've got the resonance of the artist who's lost 2 fingers, with historical anecdote of someone who lost all her toes in frostbite as she was fleeing her would-be captors and assassinators. And she was the only one out of her party of resistance fighters who survived. All the rest were killed. And she has this tremendous survivor's guilt. But she also wondered, what is it that she did, or what is it about fate that she was the one who survived? And then that's linked into a recurring image of snow and snowflakes, and also rain, because of the recycling of the water cycle. That one of the characters here posits the idea of it could be the same snowflake that's falling upon her now as fell upon a missing brother who ended up being captured and tortured, all these sorts of things. So this sort of constant recycling, not only of physical attributes like snow and rain, but of human history, of how humans treat one another. So there are all of these sort of recurring themes, and it's brilliantly tied in with how she, as I say, she moves through time. There's no markers and indicators of what time period you're in. It just slides seamlessly from one to the other into flashback without sort of pronouncing itself as flashback. It's really well done, and that sort of works with the idea of ghosts, of spirits. You know, are some of these characters dead, and that she's having revisits from the dead? It's called We Do Not Part. The idea is that restless spirits don't sort of depart for the other realm, they sort of hang around here. And one of the restless spirits is the bird that has died because she got there too late. But the bird is sort of flying around and projecting its shadow on the wall and that sort of thing. So for the first 2/3 of the book, I think it really works. The problem with the book, and why I knocked a star off, was the last third. Because her friend who was in hospital and who was having treatment every half hour on the fingers, they were being drained and cleaned and all this sort of stuff, shows up in her house, which is being cut off by the storm, by the snow. So at this point you sort of get the idea that maybe she's a spirit, maybe she's a ghost. It's never, to my mind, really sort of cleared up, which is not necessarily a problem. But the book then turns, and we no longer have this seamless transition and jumping around time. We no longer have quite the beautiful wrapping device of the snow. I mean, it's literally like a shroud, shrouding the house, shrouding her, that she has to keep warm and things. What we just have is historical fiction. We just have blah, 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 about this woman artist mother who kept an archive, maintained an archive, because she was searching for family members who'd been disappeared by the repressionary forces. And it's very straight. It's, you know, it's horrible because it's people who are snatched and arrested and either killed and dumped in pits or are tortured. It's not nice stuff, it's not easy stuff, but it is very straight. And we've lost all of the beautiful modulation of the previous 2/3 of the book. And I was not engaged. Certainly not to the extent I've been engaged by the 2/3. It just felt a little preachy, a bit of a lecture. And I couldn't see why, because she's got such skill as she's displayed in all her books, but in the first 2/3. So I did find myself a bit disappointed. I think it does sort of touch back on the White Book, on human acts. And there's nothing wrong with that. But did it take them on in a new way, in a fresh way? And in the first 2/3 it certainly did. Beautiful metaphorical imagistic language. And in the last third it certainly didn't, because it was just text. If, you know, tell, don't show. Which is not something I particularly hold to as a writer or a reader. It doesn't normally bother me. But Kang is such a good writer that it did bother me. So I gave it 4 stars. And on to Death Takes Me by Cristina Rivera Garza. Now, of the 3 new releases, this is the book that I absolutely love. 5 stars. It starts off with a poetry professor called Cristina Rivera Garza, who comes across a dead body of a murder victim in some back alleys, and it turns out that this victim has been castrated and dismembered to some parts, and on the wall is written some lines of poetry, who the poetry professor recognises as the poet Alejandra Pizarnik, who took her life at 36. And indeed, because her words permeate each of what turned out to be 4 murders, is very central to this book. Now, she's not a poet that I'm familiar with, but I've ordered one on the back of having read this. So the book starts off very much from the sort of point of view from the professor, the poetry professor, who's the person who discovers the body, is always a person of interest to detectives. And then the focus moves from her to the female detective who's charged with this case, who just has a sort of existential sense of failure about herself as a detective. Yes, she solves cases, but equally she's given all the horrible cases that seem unsolvable. She readily accepts them, and obviously this is another one. And then the book moves from focusing quite on her to her male junior colleague, because this is a book ultimately about dismemberment and about castration. Is it a male killer or is it a female killer? Is it a male killer who is jealous, who wants to possess these men and does so by cutting off their members? Or is it a female killer who is sort of declaring war on men, again, by removing their sort of seminal member, as it were? And he's the one who sort of offers the female detective the notion that it might be a male killer. And then finally, we get it's not quite a focus on her like it was on the others, a journalist who is intrigued by this sort of the poetry angle, the fact that all 4 murder scenes have this poetry on the scene, done in, one's in lipstick, one's on the pavement, one's on the walls. They're all done in slightly different styles. One's done in sort of cut-out ransom letter, cut-out newspaper, and sort of ransom note style. So her interest, and she wants to interview the professor and the detective about this, how does the poetry feed in? Now, this is a work, I think, of genius. It's a work about dismemberment and castration, not only literally in the book of these physical bodies of the human beings, and we get sort of visits to hospitals where they have specimen jars with all different bits of human anatomy on display, but also a black museum, which is a crime museum, again with sort of specimen bottles. Why is this person taking the members, and what are they doing with them, essentially? So you get that sort of physical level of castration and dismemberment, but you also have it in the nature of the text itself. And it feels like, this is why it's such a great reading experience, it almost feels like words have been excised out of the text. They haven't, but the style of the writing makes it feel like you're not getting all the information in the same way as the detective isn't getting all the information. The detective is pursuing these lines which ordinarily have nothing to do with crime, with the poetry, with going to hospitals and seeing sort of displayed specimen jars, going to a black museum, seeing the same. So she's doing all this sort of extracurricular work as well, which are relevant to the case, but bring her no closer to it. So this is not a book where you should go in expecting this is crime, thriller, and it's all about hunting down the perpetrator of these crimes. It's not. It's about the book. It's about its images. Its images almost in, images through what has been excised. The image of, as I say, castration, dismemberment is the biggest image, rather than sort of necessary similes and things like that. It's very hard to describe this book other than to say it's brilliant, and I loved it. And I'm just going to read two bits. So this is early on. This is a comment about the Pizarnik's poetry. This is the poetry professor. I read carefully. I read with a kind of knot in my throat that's about to become a domestic animal. I read and had to pour myself the first glass of water. How could I tell the detective that every poem is the inability of language to produce the presence in itself that, by simply being language, is all absence? Again, dismemberment. How could I communicate to the detective that the poem's task is not to communicate, but quite the opposite? To protect the secret place that resists all communication, all transmission, every effort of translation. How could I tell her without choking on the sip of water and the sadness that rose in me upon realising, again and again, that the tongue will never be an organ of resurrection, that words, as Pizarnik says a few lines later, in a declaration no less gloomy for its accuracy, quote, "Words do not make love, they make absence." How could I explain to this woman, so firm, so well uniformed, that while she pointed her short immaculate fingernail to the word castrated in a poem about the uselessness, the inutility of all poems, all I could do was reminisce about the language that is all memory and, in being memory, is all absence. The contour of the body and the sex of that thin, beautiful boy with a thick, manly beard that had appeared literally out of nowhere. Out of nowhere, that is sometimes the absence of language, declaring in the most jocular and light-hearted way that he was sometimes him. And again, just a final example that I'm going to read. So again, this is talking directly about Pizarnik. My lack of rhythm when I write, disjointed phrases, impossibility of forming sentences, of conserving the traditional grammatical structure, I'm missing the subject. Then I'm missing the verb. What's left is a mutilated predicate. Tattered attributes I don't know who or what to give them to. This is due to a lack of meaning in my internal elements. No, it's more like a problem of attention, and above all, a sort of castration of the ear. I cannot perceive the melody of a sentence. That's also where my curious intonation, my oral difficulties come from. What I'm saying here has come to be my emblem. My oral difficulties are caused by my distance from reality. So I just thought this is superb. It's an unusual book because it doesn't really resolve anything. And plenty of books are like that, but it doesn't resolve anything in a particularly unique style, I think, if that's not a contradiction in terms. So I love this, 5 stars, and I'm going to be intrigued when I've ordered a book of Pizarnik's poetry, and I'm going to be intrigued just how central the ideas of this book are culled from Pizarnik's poetry, because they seem very much so, but maybe they're not quite so central. I mean, that last piece I read, as far as I could tell, is from Pizarnik's own writing. Anyway. So that's something I will set myself as a task when the Pizarnik poetry arrives. 5 stars. On the Greenwich Line by Shady Lewis, who's an Egyptian migrant in the UK, and very much is dealing with that experience. But the problem I had with this book, how many chapters are there? 7 or 8 chapters. It seemed to me that each chapter introduces to new characters because the author wasn't confident enough of suturing and seamlessly knitting together a plot, evolving from one chapter into the next. There are themes that run throughout it. So, for example, the protagonist works for the local council. He's a local civil servant. And a Syrian immigrant has died and has no family over in the UK to sort of be responsible to return the body to for a burial. All his family is still in Syria. And our Egyptian immigrant is contacted by a friend of his in Syria, I think, or no, in Egypt, but who knew the family and acts as a go-between between the family in Syria and him. And initially they're planning on coming to the UK and to repatriate the body, but they can't get visas and it's too expensive. So in the end they agree collectively that this guy, even though he doesn't know the deceased, never met the deceased, will give him a decent burial. So that theme does run through it. But as I say, every chapter introduces to new characters and different parts of his life, as if the author didn't have the confidence to weave a whole novel with more themes running through it. And so it almost read like a book of short stories. And in fact, not short stories, but it felt very autobiographical. I've no idea if it is or it isn't. But because there wasn't this sort of iron core at the heart of this, it felt like an author casting back into his memories of incidents as an immigrant in London, and each chapter was revolved around a different incident that weren't necessarily related to previous ones, other than they've been experienced by the same person. So I was very disappointed in this book. So I gave it, I think 2.5 stars. And on to 2 books of poetry. Solmaz Sharif is an American poet of Iranian extraction, and this book, this collection, very much bites the hand that feeds her, and I'm all for that. I thought it was terrific. So she's having a pop at the sort of Shah's Iran that forced her family to flee. She's having a go at the American authorities and the sort of humiliations of having to sort of go through immigration each time she flies back home to America. She's having a go at poets and poetry and the poetry scene. She's having a go at everyone. But interestingly, I don't think the anger is overdone. I think it's actually quite nicely pitched. It's not sort of hysterical. It's not sort of brattish. I'm going to read 2 poems as an example. So this is called Visa. From past participle of videre, or to see. The site decided by officer. The officer decided by blood sugar, last blowjob received, and relative level of disdain for vermin. Domestic terminals do not have this railing at the exit. As we wait for her to exit customs, our sightline is obstructed by opaque sliding doors. The twisting hallways behind it, the small convex mirror hung in the corner in which we catch shapes growing larger, into hair colour, into gait, into age, and finally as they turn, into kin. The hours I've stood there behind that railing, the hours I've stood to savour the seconds earlier, seconds more by which my eye may reach the disembarking, and exclaimed, "She's here!" Watch from shadow to shape to gait, my imagined life come to life and approach briefly me. My imagined life crying hot in my ear, ink on its finger pads. This will be the last I write of it directly, I say each time. This is a light that lights everything and dimly. All my waiting at this railing, all my writing is this squint. So again, I think that's perfectly pitched, that sort of anger and irritation and sense of being humiliated. But she doesn't go overboard. It's done in beautiful poetic language. And this next one, Persistence of Vision. Gwendolyn Brooks. In the rear view, fog extinguishes the hills of new money, mansions on acres away from road or sight, their architected privacy, windows to look out at, a land that won't look back. The fog-secured drapery, its space to dance through, they buy, and what one might call dappled light, moving across their acres, light through their oaks, moving over their mares, brushed to a sheen. Palms of sugar cubes, soft snorting, I bet. Here, Maya Bridge proved their horses fly a moment. In their homes, they can't hear each other call from foyer to pool house. I am jealous of this loneliness most of all. Loneliness delimited by colonnade and cold-pressed juices. They make excellent corpses among the expensive flowers. I imagine hills and hills dappled like this. Lovely stuff. And finally, Plot by Claudia Rankine. This is, I think, the last of her collections before she did an American lyric trilogy. I've read and loved 2 and 3 of the American trilogy. I didn't realise it was a trilogy, so I've now ordered, on the basis of this, I've ordered the first one. So, Plot has all sorts of resonances. Plot is in story, plot is in a graveyard plot, plot is in to plot on a graph. The plot here is one that most people in the world experience, which is having a child. When I say most people experience, I mean as a couple, not obviously only a woman can experience having a baby grow inside her. And there are 3 characters, or 2 really, 3 named people. Liv is the pregnant woman. Erland is her partner. And they've named the baby in a sort of joking way, Ersatz, because that Ersatz is absolutely key to this. This is a book about pregnancy and growth and development. It has also later, in the latter half of the collection, all the sort of fears and anxieties of mothers-to-be and fathers-to-be, the impact on their relationship, how it's going to affect their ability to do other things in their life, socialise, all that sort of stuff. That's there, and to be honest, less interesting, less engaging. What is so brilliant is the metaphorical and imagistic stuff of an unseen being inside her before it starts kicking, before the first ultrasound plots the baby through sound. The notion of there are characters on a stage, Shakespeare's all the words of stage, so those aspects of plot. But it's that language of this difficult to picture relationship of a clump of cells that's gradually developing and maturing, but you don't see it, or you may have a 2D image of it on an ultrasound photo. But so this is how the book starts. Submerged deeper than appetite, she bit into a freakish anatomy, the hard plastic of filiation, a fetus dream, once severed, reattached, the baby femur, not fork tender through flesh, the baby face now anchored. That's the first words of this collection, and it just ushers you straight into the majesty and the beauty and the sheer imaginative associations of applying images to something that you can't see. It's a brilliant device. So again, I'm just going to read one stanza from the first sort of full poem, as it were. The drive-in utero is fiction-filled, arbiter of the cut-out infant and mainstreamed. Why birth the other to watch the seam rip, to roughly conjoin the lacerating generations? Lineage means to step here on the likelihood of involution, then hard not to notice the depth of rot at the fleshy roots. To this outbreak of doubt she crosses her legs, the weight of one thigh on the next, constructed rectitude, the heavy, heavy devotion of no ersatz. As I say, the first half of this carries on in that vein all the way through, and is brilliant. I did feel there was a bit of a drop-off in the second half when it was more conventional, as I say, feelings of maternal, paternal, etc, etc, etc. But it's the language is so stunning in that first half. 5 stars. And that's it for this wrap-up. I'm currently reading non-fiction, Kate Zambreno, The Book of Mütter. This is brilliant. This will be 5 stars. About 2/3 of the way through it. I had hoped I would finish it in order to include it in this collection, but circumstances didn't allow. Yeah, this is wonderful stuff. This is the second Kate Zambreno non-fiction I've read, and she's just a wonderful writer. But I'll talk about this more in the next wrap-up. So there you have it. Till next time. Thanks very much.